Alrighty, guys and gals, let's take a quick look at a game I just played. So I've adjusted the screen so you can't see the move order because this was a wild from start to finish. So I have the white pieces. I start off with my queen's pawn. I'm looking for the queen's gambit. My opponent declines the gambit. Now, if they had decided to take, I know what to do in that case. And if they had decided to decline, which they did, I am prepared in both cases. Mostly when we play the queen's gambit lines, I see declining of this gambit. So that's mostly what I prepare for. Anyway, the next standard move set is going to be something along the knight to c3. This is our standard move that we know is going to happen. I don't need to do it yet, and I'm trying to play games where I hold off making this commitment just in case anything weird happens. I know it's going to happen. I mean, I know I'm going to go there. So I've always got it in reserved. This other knight these are the two typical moves, right? And so I would go ahead and move my other knight first. My opponent moves his knight out. This is a very standard structure. My knight to, if my knight had gone here, this is almost an identical textbook style opening structure for Queen's Gambit lines. Anyway, that's not the move I made. The move I actually made was getting my bishop out early. So the goal to get my bishop out early is so that I can push this pawn so I can get my light square bishop out so that I can castle earlier. So I'm trying to adjust the move order so that I can get castled faster. I don't know if it's smart to do or not, but that's my goal. My opponent then goes ahead and captures the pawn, so I have to blockade it. This is a very well-known bishop pin. So my bishop is pinning this knight here. Notice that knight can't move. I don't want this knight to move anyway because it's blockading this pawn, but there are other reasons for this particular move order. The one thing that I do know is if this bishop takes, I take back with the pawn, and I'm still blockading my opponent's pawn. So I'm still in good shape there. Let's follow along. I get my pawn move, and now I am ready to capture back. This is where this is something new that I have not seen before. This knight move seems very aggressive. And I'll be honest with you, I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what this means. But honestly, this is what I was looking at. All right, this knight to the f2 square does have a fork. But there's nothing else defending that square. So I can always take back with my king, should I need to, right? I can take back with my king, and then there's no harm, no foul. So I spent a while trying to figure out exactly what my opponent was going for here. Yes, I can't take because it's pinned. That's okay. I'm going to get my bishop out of the way, and then I'm going to castle here in a second. So I get my bishop out of the way, and I'm ready to castle. I was not expecting this. This capture of the knight here changes the game. And it is something that I definitely need to be aware of in my Queen's Gambit games. This is kind of leading me to believe that maybe this bishop that I pushed out earlier, maybe this bishop belongs on b2. Maybe it belongs there, but it can't belong there. But either way, it can't belong there. Notice, because the only way to do that would be that I'd have to push this pawn up. And you'll see what happens. If you don't see it yet, you're about to see it. So pause your video and tell me the problem. Right, let's take a look. From this layout, what is the problem we have? If you said that when this bishop captures with check, bringing my knight back to defend is a solid choice, that was exactly what I was thinking too in the game. But did you notice this? So undefended, well, not undefended, but a rook on the same diagonal. So when my opponent makes this capture, yes, I can totally defend the check, still give myself the availability to castle, but I am dropping an exchange. So I go down the exchange at this point in time. Yeah, a lot of pooper snooples were said. Notice I do have development, right? My pieces are developed. My opponent is missing development. So all I have to do is castle, and I'm fully developed, which is my opponent's next move and my next move. So we're both castled. I have development. My opponent doesn't have development, but what he has is he has a rook of mine. So he's traded away a bishop for a rook. That's a good trade. And if we look at the engine, let's see what the engine says from this point. Oh, you can't see it exactly. Oh, yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. Yeah, the engine's saying it's... Yeah, 2.5 to my favor. Yeah, that almost 3 points in my favor. So 1, 2. Yeah, the engine says about 3 points in my favor. So you can see the ignore the numbers, right? The numbers are the square numbers, but this is this is a center point, and you can see that black is leading this game. So my opponent has a significant advantage going to this point, and that's about typical for an exchange. So I decided to keep playing the game like I always do, just because I want to learn what I can learn. I have my knight is defending my bishop, but my knight is undefended, so I want to get my knight defended. I'd like to get my knight back into the game somehow, and so I'd like to move my bishop out of the way. I don't know exactly where to go, but putting it here seems to be pretty good. It is double defended, but if my knight moves, then my bishop is still defended. Pretty strong move by my opponent here to get his queen into the game. My knight is back into the game. My opponent's lining up for a pretty strong attack. There is a nice outpost here for my knight, so I'm pretty content with this outpost. Notice my opponent is up in material, so what's he gonna do? Obviously, he wants to trade. Normally, I wouldn't trade material, except I get to trade and get a nice outpost for my bishop, a strong defended central square for my bishop, which is attacking my opponent's queen. Gives me, I have the bishop pair, so I have to really make sure that my bishop pair is doing work. That's the only real advantage I have at this point in time, is to use my bishop pair. Opponent's queen gets out of the way. Here's my next thought process, right? I have two pretty strong bishops. All I have to do is transition this bishop to this diagonal, get my light square bishop aiming at the h7 square, get my dark square bishop aiming at the g7 square, and I have, you know, that's what I have to use, and so I have to power them up as best I can. Notice getting my bishop over here to this diagonal puts pressure on my opponent's queen, which is now out here, out in the board. I can't talk. Words, Joseph, use your words. I don't have very good words. In any event, I want to get my queen up involved. Getting my queen along this, the queen move I make to c3 basically reinforces the fact that my bishop is coming to c2 along this diagonal to pressure my opponent's queen. I'm not sure what the goal is here, but my first thought is my opponent is going to run this pawn down, put pressure on my pawn here on the center of the board. You know, my g2 pawn is one of my main defenders at this point in time, and it is pinned. So I want to take away some of that wherever I can. I was debating on, in fact, I don't know what the engine says here. The engine says it doesn't care at all. All right, there's a free pawn I probably should have taken, but I moved h3, and the engine says that was a bad move. If I had gone h4, the engine says it's not quite as bad. So, yeah, either way, I did not take here because I wasn't prepared to throw my queen down the board yet. And notice his bishop is still defended. This pawn is defended. So I don't, stealing a pawn would be nice, but I was not ready to go for that line. Basically, I just wanted to defend against my opponent running their bishop down. Now my opponent is getting ready to get his bishop out. And this is what I'm fully expecting. A ton of pressure along this diagonal. So I want to keep that in mind, and I'm probably going to simply push my pawn up, which will stop the queen's intrusion. It does give my opponent's a light square bishop a nice long diagonal. He can, if he gets his queen over to the e4 square, then I'm starting to run into more trouble. I still could push my f pawn if I have to, which would give me 3 pawns here along the third rank. Not super great, but if I have to, like, this is the thought process I'm thinking is number 1, watch out for this alignment. Number 2, watch out for this alignment. So those are in the back of my mind. One of these alignment issues I can take away by continuing my plan of bringing my bishop to c2. So I get my bishop to c2. It does cut off the my opponent's queen. My opponent needs to now move their queen out of the way. But they didn't. So now I pause for a quick second. Yes, my last rook is under attack. But all things being even, all things being equal or even, equal plus even equals equin. All things being even, I'm happy to trade my rook for a queen. That gets me back in the game. So that's what I do. I take his queen, he takes my rook. My opponent did pause there for a few seconds, so I feel like he may have missed that I was taking his queen, or maybe he thought it was a great move. Not certain, honestly. So now if we count the material on the board, we've got two rooks and a bishop. So that's 13 points in pieces. And I have got a queen and 2 bishops. So that's 9, 12, 15. So 15 points in pieces to my opponent's 13 points in pieces. If we count up the pawns, I am down a pawn. So my opponent has an extra pawn. So there's about a, what did I say? 15 versus 13 with 1 pawn difference. So there's only really 1 point of material difference on the board. He is up, essentially, 1 point. No, is that right? Am I, math. Why is math in my head while I'm talking so hard? I need to be able to write it down. I'm better when I write it down. Anyway, there is not a massive imbalance in pieces at this point in time. I definitely want to capture his bishop. He's going to capture my bishop, so I do the move order slightly different, and I take another pawn to try to even the pawn. So now he's got 6 pawns, and I've got 6 pawns. So our pawn situation is even. And notice I can do this because it comes with check, forces him to take back. So now our pawn situation is even. I've got a queen and a piece to 2 rooks. I'm now up in material. So I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good at this point in time. Notice this was coming next. So queen taking on c7 would come with check. My opponent rightly defended. I went ahead for a cheeky move at this point. I probably should have moved my pawn up out of the way, give my opponent a pawn back to open up this diagonal so I could steal this pawn. And stealing this pawn comes with the threat of checkmate. I probably should have done that. I wonder what the engine says I should probably do at this point. Engine don't care. Yeah, I'm way up, and I mean, you could see I'm way up now. My opponent's king is exposed. His pawns are separated into 3 little islands, right? 1 island, 2 island, 3. If he gets these 2 connected, that'd be 3 islands, and I've only got 2 islands, and one of them's a pretty big chain. Granted, I've got 2 weak backwards pawns, but so far they're defended. Either way, I go ahead and steal this cheeky pawn. Notice my opponent can't take back because that's undefended square. So his plan now is to get this pawn pushed either there or there to get his rook up so he can get a second attacker on that bishop so he can steal some material back, which is exactly what he goes for. I now get my queen involved. Notice I have a few options, mostly check with the threat of picking up the rook. So my opponent actually now has to keep this rook defended. Instead, he goes for the attack. I had my queen attacking d7 square, so I take it. Now rook is undefended. Now the pieces start to drop. Notice my opponent still can't take because I have it covered. Now my bishop is now free. It is no longer pinning to my queen, so yep, my opponent has to start getting his pawn out of the way. So from here on out, it becomes basically, what can I do to frustrate my opponent? I'm now up in material. I have two pieces, two strong pieces to his one piece. His king is in the middle of the board. So there's probably a mating net somewhere. Notice my pawns are defending all of these squares. If my opponent gets his king down here, he could squeeze through this way, right? And that's fine. I just don't want him to get over here to help his pawns. So the first thing I do is I throw a check in. Notice this gives me an option to get involved this way to pick up these two. Now I have two attackers in that pawn. My opponent moves his king out of the way. Next comes the thought process of let's cut the king off. So I have this. Cut the king off. My queen is ready. I can't take because of the rook is defending it, but I'm at least cutting the king off. So the king is now cannot go any here. The king can't go down here. The king can't go here. So I've put a little bit of pressure on my opponent's king. My bishop is defended. I think this is probably a too little too late kind of move. Notice he is attacking my queen, right? But I got lots of other moves my queen can do, right? I can swing over here, out of the way, start picking up these pawns. I've got a passed pawn over here. I mean, I end up making a passed pawn on this side. I can try to target the e6 pawn so that my d pawn can become a passed pawn. So a lot of options. Which option would you guys do? Let's, stop and take a think about what you would consider doing. Notice you can get your queen to the to a8. You could get your queen down here to a3. Either one puts pressure on this pawn. Now the opponent could simply push that pawn, but then all you do is you drop your queen back in between, and you have targeting on both of them. And now you've blockaded the defending pawn, so your queen then can pick up the defense pawn. This pawn is blockaded, so that becomes a very strong move set to come down here to a3. Somewhat similar, if you come over here to a8, notice to defend the pawn, the opponent would have to push the pawn, at which point in time, you just slide your queen down here in between them. Now, it's not blockading anything, but there's nothing they can do. So if the opponent pushes your pawn, you can capture now the undefended one. If they try to push again, you can still capture, and you have made a passed pawn. Or you can go with the option that I went to. I went to the e8 square. I have pinned this rook. This rook cannot move. And I can pick up a pawn here for free. I do have some defense here. So I do have a little bit of defense. Most importantly, I have a queen that can get down the board really quickly. So these two pawns are connected passed pawns. And I do want to be concerned about them, but I'm not that concerned about them. Maybe I should pay more attention to them, but in my mind, if my opponent pushes, I take. He's going to have to push this way first. So he's got at least 1, 2 moves, 3, he's got 2 moves before it becomes a real problem. I capture, he captures back. Then he still has 1, 2 moves to make. Now, granted, one of those does come with check, but at that point in time, I can always just swing my queen over here. And even if he pushes with check, I can always capture down that way. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that pretty well? I hope I am. So Maybe connected pass pawns should be a concern for me, but right now they're not. So I simply pick up the pawn with check, so my opponent has to block. I still have this move in reserve to come back and pick up these two loose pawns. My opponent blocks. I could make another exchange, right? I'm up in material, so even if this were an even trade, I'm kind of okay with it. However, it is a trade that benefits me, so I'm probably gonna do it. So I go ahead and do it. I still have time to get back here. Oh, this was a fun. Yeah, I forgot about this. So that's the square I'm looking at. So throw a check in the board. My opponent has to move another check just to figure out where my opponent's going, but I've got these two pawns. By getting here, I can now pick up the defending pawn. My opponent has really no moves at this point. The best they can hope for is to go for a stalemate. They're just down way too much material. I'm going to pick up this, and I'm going to have two passed pawns that can go up here. And also importantly, I have 4.5 minutes on the clock. So there is tons of time on the clock. My opponent has tons of time on the clock too, so the game's not over, but a queen plus 3 pawns is going to be very difficult for my opponent's, basically just his king to stop. There are still several moves my opponent can make, so he's not in stalemate. At this point, I would pick up this pawn here, and then I would look to get my queen, probably cutting off my opponent's king somehow. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I'd continue this game, honestly. Probably just go for the easy win and push some pawns. Push some pawns, get another queen. Go for the easy win. So anyway, this was a pretty interesting game. A lot of back and forth. A lot of it stemmed from trying to figure out where this bishop goes. Notice if I had gone with this move order, what did my opponent do next? Let's see, bishop f4. He took here. No, I would have probably taken back this way, honestly. That still doesn't help with this. Yeah, it still doesn't help with this move set, but I guess, yeah, because then I can take this. Because then he takes, I take back, he takes, and he still picks up. So this is a trap that I'm going to have to figure out from the white side, how to avoid it. And I guess the idea here is this particular square I guess we have to make the let's go back. Let's take a look at what the engine says. Go back to the very beginning of the game. Delete all these extra things. I'm going to look at the engine and the database and see what it says. Turn the engine on. I make my knight move. My opponent plays the bishop. Oh, wow. Yeah, look at this. So here's a tactic. Now, it is defensible because this defends it, but no, that doesn't stop this. Never mind. That doesn't help. Undo that. Let's not do that. Yeah, it looks like just pushing. That helps. Okay. So maybe after all this, really this bishop belongs on d2. If the bishop goes to d2, that can't be so bad, right? Opponent takes, I move my knight, he drives here. Yeah, I've got 2 defenders on it, so I'm good. Okay, so maybe that's where it belongs after all. Maybe I need to start considering this d2 move. And if I consider the d2 move, then I don't need to wait on pushing this pawn. That's another thing, is I don't need to wait on pushing this pawn. I can go ahead and get my knight out, push the pawn, get my light square bishop involved in the game. And if you were to do something like this, then I could go ahead and get it defended there. Takes, 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 takes. Yeah. Those are all even exchanges. Okay. So maybe Queen's Gambit. If we play the Queen's Gambit, maybe the Bishop. I'm going to try that. So, all right, guys. The next few games I'm going to try to play with the Queen's Gambit. If I get a Queen's Gambit game, I'm going to try putting my dark square bishop up here on d2 and see what that looks like. I have not... I have seen what can happen when I move it out of the way. So let's see what happens if we keep it in the way. And that gives us a chance to push our e-pawn, get our light square bishop out early, and then castle earlier. All right. Well, let's try that. I'm going to go look for some more games, and I will catch you guys next time. Later.